Your life's not like anyone else's, and chances are you found yourself on adventures you never planned to take. It's all part of this crazy journey we call life. Learning how to embrace the unexpected while working to live your best life is not easy, but you've come to the right place. Because in my world, if it's highly unlikely, it's practically guaranteed to happen. I'm Lavina Perry, and this is the Highly Unlikely Podcast. Grieving is a difficult journey and can be really challenging to navigate without any sort of professional support. But what do you do when your children are grieving at the same time? Welcome to the Highly Unlikely Podcast. Today I'm going to talk about something that I have avoided for the last few years because I wasn't sure if I was in an emotional place where I could share any sort of strategies that I had learned or if I had really done anything that was worth sharing. But over the course of this past summer, I had two friends that lost their spouses. And as much as my heart goes out to both of them, it's really their children that I was concerned for after parenting my own children through losing their father. So I want to share some of the strategies that I learned because this is something that nobody prepares you for. And it's a really difficult thing to go through. And a lot of people have no idea how to address the needs of their children and the huge shift in the dynamic, the parent-child relationship, because there is no handbook for what it is that you're dealing with. With that in mind, I'm going to share some of the big mistakes that I made, how I corrected them, and things that I learned from parenting my three children through losing their dad, and just some of the things that I learned that you can use if you're currently taking this journey yourself. And if you know someone who's going through this, please pass this information on to them because this is an extremely challenging situation to be in. And oftentimes, people who are in the midst of it are not emotionally in a place where they can reach out for the help that they need. So, the first thing that I want to talk about is the importance of talking about their loved one. I didn't talk about Jason for a very long time after he died. I had a lot of negative emotions and I was going through a lot of anger about what had happened and what he did. And I didn't want to pass that negativity on to my children. I didn't want to soil their memories and their image of their father. And so rather than share honestly with them about how I was feeling and why I was feeling that way, I chose to share nothing. And I did that in an effort to spare them pain. But in the end, it ended up being more painful for them that I didn't talk about him at all and that it was almost as if he never existed. And this created a wall between us, an emotional wall that prevented us from communicating at a time when communication was so important. But then we found Judy's house about 9 months after he had passed away. And Judy's House is an organization here in Denver, Colorado that provides counseling for families who have suffered a loss in their immediate family. So a parent, a child, a sibling. And it separates you out so that for the kids, they're in their age group with children who have suffered a similar loss, and the adults in groups of people that have suffered a similar loss. My eyes were completely opened on the very first day that we went to Judy's house. And for the first time in 9 months, I was sitting in a room full of people that I felt actually understood what I was going through. And I did not feel alone for the very first time in 9 months. And as I left group therapy one night, we were on our way home from Judy's house. I was very nervous to talk to my kids, which seems so odd now because we're in such a different place. But at the time, because we had not spoken about anything regarding their dad's death. And so I was very, very just anxious about bringing it up because I wasn't sure what reaction they would have and whether or not I was emotionally prepared for that reaction. So I just said, I'm very sorry that we have not been more open in talking about your dad and everything that happened, but I want you to know that I am here for you. And if there's any questions that you have or a conversation that you need to have, I'm here for you, and I'm here to listen and to answer your questions without judgment. And then we sat silently in the car for 30 minutes as we drove home. And as we pulled in the garage, one more time, I just said, do you have any questions? And they sat there for a second, and then one of my daughters said, so how did Dad die? And then I realized that even though they knew that their dad had taken his own life, they still had a lot of questions about how and what had happened. And that was a really scary place for me to be in because I didn't want to talk about it. But through going to therapy, I had learned how important it was for them to know those things in order for them to be able to process it and move through their own grief journey. They had to have those questions answered. So we talked for just a minute and they didn't have any more questions that night, so we went inside the house. But just that 1 minute of conversation cracked open that door that had been sealed shut and was the beginning of a very important series of conversations that we had regarding their dad and his death, which was a real turning point in our journey and the process of grieving that we all had to go through, because none of us were alone anymore. We had each other and we began to rely on each other. And that was actually a really beautiful thing to happen for us because we had all been suffering alone and in silence up to that point. So, some things that you need to remember when you're helping your children through this process is you need to observe the birthday and special days of their loved one. This allows children to remain connected to that person that they loved. That person may not physically be here anymore, but emotionally, children need to know that that person is still loved and that their life mattered. And by observing their birthday and those special days, that gives importance and meaning to that person's life. You also need to be honest about how they died. This is one, especially with really small children, that we try and in our effort to make it understandable for the child, we actually are creating much bigger problems for them rather than just being honest and concrete about what transpired. So don't tell them that they went to sleep and that they're not ever going to wake up, or that they went to heaven as if the person just traveled there, right? So you need to explain death and dying to them as in a situation of permanence, but not one that is going to create psychological fears for them or unrealistic expectations. So if you tell your child that they went to sleep and they're never going to wake up, that can actually create a situation for a small child where they are now going to be terrified about falling asleep themselves, and they're also going to have anxiety and fear about you sleeping. And every time you go to sleep, they can be worried that you're not going to wake up. What happens if you go to sleep and you don't wake up, and now I don't have my parent and I don't have my sibling, so, or whatever the loss is for that child. So being honest about what death is really important. And if you are a religious person and you believe that that person's soul has gone on to heaven, you need to explain that in a way that doesn't make them think that the person just got in the car or on an airplane and flew to heaven and that there's a chance that they're going to come back and that they're going to see them again. Or saying, well, I want to go to heaven. Can I go visit them? These are things that I've actually seen children go through and been with parents whose children are having this very experience. So explaining that the person's body has died, and if you believe that they have a soul and that that soul has gone on to heaven, you need to make it clear that it was the person's spirit that left and not the person themselves. That can be very, very confusing for small children, and they may need to talk through it a lot before their brain can actually process that information and wrap their head around it, which can be really taxing to go through. But it's really, really important for their psychological healing and their ability to process things and move on that we're just honest about what happened. Completely honest. So I understand that these conversations, especially if you have never experienced this or gone through it closely with someone, can seem really extreme, and they're very, very difficult. These conversations are just, they're challenging beyond words if you haven't been through it yourself. It may be hard to understand why they're so important. But these types of conversations open up the lines of communication between you and your child, and they are essential to making it so that your child feels that they can come to you. And that really is the key to helping them through this process, is that when they have something that's going on, they feel like they can come to you and that they can talk to you and they can have the really difficult conversations with you. If you can talk to them about how their loved one died, and you can talk to them about what that means for their soul, or what that means for your family, or how they died. If it was a suicide, that is an extraordinarily painful conversation to have, because it was the person's choice to do that. And that's something that is just unbelievably difficult for a child to wrap their mind around. But by having that conversation, by being willing to dive into the difficult conversations, you are opening those lines of communication so that they can come to you with other things that they are struggling with. They already know you're willing to put yourself into an emotional and difficult place to communicate with them, so they know that if they have something else that's difficult and emotional, they can bring that to you, and you're going to be a safe place for them to share what it is that they're dealing with. So please have the honest conversations and talk about their loved one and celebrate those special days, because that is going to open the doors of communication for your child so that they can come to you with whatever it is that they're struggling with on their grief journey. The next strategy that is also really essential for your child when they're dealing with grief is to get them into some sort of therapy, whether that is group therapy or individual therapy. I suggest group therapy with other children their own age who have suffered a similar loss. The reason that this is so important is because being a child who's grieving the loss of a loved one can be very, very isolating, and they can feel like they are the only one. And that is a terrible place to be for a child, especially middle school age and high school, and even some older elementary children, to feel like they're the oddball, or that they are alone and that nobody understands what it is that they're going through. So by putting them into a group where other children are suffering the same loss, that helps them to know that they are not alone, and that there are people out there that really understand what it is that they're going through, that they can form friendships with, and that they can bond with, and that they can travel with on their grief journey. This also gives them a safe place where they can talk about all of the emotions and all the things that they are going through in their head, because some of that is not pretty, because grieving is a really ugly process, and being in a situation with the counselor allows them to share those things with someone there that is a professional that can help mediate the conversation and help them to walk through all of those things in a really healthy way that will get them to a place of healing rather than allowing all of those big emotions and those ugly feelings that they have and these terrible thoughts that they're having to damage them psychologically. We want our children to get to a place of emotional healing from their grief. And it's really important to involve a counselor in that process. And being in a group therapy session is beneficial on two fronts because it allows them to have peers that truly understand what they're going through, but it also allows them to have that professional person that can help them walk that journey in a really healthy way. The next thing that is essential when you have children who are grieving is to allow them to grieve in their own way. Everyone grieves differently. Grief is unique to each person who goes through it. Every single person in my family grieves differently. And I did not know that for a really long time because I didn't know that grief was unique and that everybody walks it in a different way. And so the fact that my children weren't talking to me about the things that they were going through made me think that they were having the same experience that I was having, but from a child's perspective rather than an adult's perspective. And I was completely wrong. And when I discovered that all of them were grieving differently, it helped me to go through and figure out how they were grieving. So I have a child who does not talk about losing her dad. She doesn't talk about her dad at all. And in fact, she's actually blocked out a lot of the events that happened around her dad's death. So the week after he died, leading up to the funeral, she has flashes of memories of things that happened, but most of it is completely gone, which is not unusual with a child facing a big trauma at a young age, especially the age that she was at the time that she lost her dad. But that's not to say that she will never remember those things. And so helping her to get into an emotionally healthy place and helping her to work through the emotions and the memories that she does have in a healthy way sets her up for success down the road if she does have more memories or if she gets to a place where she wants to take that journey and she wants to remember and she wants to work through the things that she does remember and the emotions that went with all of that. But I couldn't help her get to that place until I understood where she was at. So I had to figure out how each one of my children was grieving in order to go through that process. I have another child who wants to talk about it all the time and wants to be very open and emotional about losing her dad. Those are two opposite end of the spectrum types of grieving living inside the walls of my home, which creates a whole new challenge because you have to respect the way that each person grieves while allowing each person to grieve in their own way. And if you have one person who never wants to hear about it and you have another person who wants to talk about it all the time, how do you bring those two things together in a cohesive way where everybody's getting what they need in order to grieve in their own way? So for our family, we made a rule that everyone gets to grieve in their own way and that everyone else has to respect everyone else's right to grieve in their own way. So for the child who never wants to talk about it or hear about it, she had to learn to just walk away and go have her own space. And the child who wants to talk about it all the time learned that if she wants to have a conversation, she maybe can pull me aside and we can go have that conversation so that it's not infringing on the other one's right to not have the conversation. And yes, that is extraordinarily complicated and challenging, but we have grown into it. It didn't happen all at once. We didn't wake up one morning and say, this is how we are, and everything was great. This was something that we worked into. It's something that we practiced a lot, and something that we figured out how to make it work over time. Another challenge comes up when you do have a child that wants to talk obsessively about the death and about their loved one, and you are opposite of that. That can be extraordinarily challenging for a parent, and I would say my best advice is to let them talk. Every parent who's ever had a child knows that your child will want to talk about things that you are not interested in. If you have a child who was obsessed with, I'm going to really date myself by saying this because the things that were popular when my kids were little are not popular anymore. So, I had children that were obsessed with Barney, and I couldn't stand Barney at all. So if they wanted to talk about Barney and they wanted to watch Barney and it was all things Barney that they were interested in, as a parent, I had to set my own feelings aside to allow them to have the joy of loving Barney. So, as with everything we do as parents, we have to sometimes set our own emotions aside and work through them at an appropriate time and deal with them at an appropriate time while we give our children the space to have their needs fulfilled. And if that means for your child that they need to talk about their loved one and they want to talk about it a lot, that you need to allow them the space to talk about it. That doesn't mean that you can't set boundaries, but you do need to provide that space for that to happen. And working with a therapist to figure out how to do that may be essential, especially if it's causing you great pain to have those conversations and you're emotionally not in a place where you can be supportive of your child. You will need to work with a therapist to figure out how to make that happen, because you are responsible for walking your child through this journey and making sure that they have a place where they can heal emotionally from their loss. And if that is in conflict with the way that you grieve and the way that you process, please find a professional to help you to work through that so that you can find a way to incorporate your child's need for healing with your need for healing, no matter how different they may be. And that leads to the next important foundation for successfully walking your children through grief is to seek professional help. A lot of children, when they're grieving, they regress or they go through other really hard things as part of their grief because they have all of this emotional turmoil that they don't know what to do with it, and it actually expresses itself in behavioral and physical ways because grieving affects your whole body, which is something that not a lot of people understand. It can make you physically ill. It can also cause behavior changes and a lot of other things in children. So some children may regress, no longer be able to sleep alone. They may not want to go to school or to ever leave your side. And these things are really emotionally difficult to deal with. So seeking a professional to help you with it is a really good idea. You have never walked this path before. You have no experience with it. You have no training for it. So seek out someone who does and let them help you navigate the path. You don't need to expect to be an expert. This is your very first time going through it. And there's going to be things that come up that you have no idea what to do with it or how to handle it. And I would also say that even if you know other people who have gone through this, their journey and the things that they deal with are going to be very different than your own. So finding a professional, seeking out someone who specializes in grieving children or grief therapy, that not just for your children but for yourself, will provide you with someone that you can express those big emotions to and express all of your frustrations and ask for help and seek that guidance that you need, because they can be a mediator to help work through communication problems, behavior problems, setting boundaries, opening those lines of communication. And that sets a really important tone for your family's grief journey that removes the stigma of seeking out a therapist and getting help. And it really opens it up to make it a normal thing for your family. If you're willing to seek help and you are bringing your children to get help, you are setting a tone for their whole life. That when they're struggling and they have something really big that they don't know how to deal with, that they need help with, they're not going to be afraid to go and seek professional guidance. And that is so important. That is so important, not just for grieving children, but for children and families who are going through anything big, whether it's a divorce or whether you have someone in your house who's struggling with mental health issues, or whether you have a child who hasn't coped well with a big move or a change of schools. These types of things can be much easier to navigate if you involve someone who is a professional that can help open up the lines of communication and work through all of those big things in your life with some professional guidance. So don't be afraid to go get professional help. I highly recommend it. The next thing is, as tempting as it will be to just let everything go, you need to have rules and you need to be consistent with your children. When a child loses someone who is significant to them, their whole world and the foundation of everything that they believed to exist is disrupted. And as a result of that disruption to everything normal in their life, they are going to be seeking out, where are the new boundaries? All of this stuff that existed in their head, and they knew like where every boundary was, what they could do, what they should be doing, and what they couldn't do. All of that has been ripped away. Everything that they believed to exist before no longer exists. And so you need to establish those boundaries and keep those safe boundaries in place. Children who have boundaries feel safe. They feel grounded, and it allows them to have a nice foundation for how they need to behave, what they can expect, and what they can and cannot do. And that is really important to a child's development. Boundaries provide them with safety and security. And we all want safety and security. But for children, if they don't have that, you'll often see that expressed in a lot of really unpleasant ways. So by providing them with rules and boundaries and being consistent with those things, even though you're really struggling yourself, that will actually make things easier for you, even if it's really difficult at first, because when a child is trying to find the boundaries, often you're dealing with some really awful behavior and some bad behaviors while they try to figure out where those boundaries are. Once they find out these are the boundaries and they're like, okay, here's the boundaries, and they're feeling more safe and more secure and more stable, that actually makes it easier for you to go through your own grief journey, because you're not going to be constantly struggling with trying to redefine things for your child. They will know where the boundaries are, leads them to safety and security and stability, which allows you to be able to walk through your grief journey a little bit easier. And I will also say that it's okay for the rules to be different than they were before, as long as the rules are consistent. The next thing is to accept that grief will permanently change your child. They are never going to be how they were before. You will never be how you were before. There will be, over time, a new sense of normalcy and how things are, but that will look very different than they were before the loss. And that's okay. Significant loss and trauma permanently changes who we are. And that is the same for your child. You will miss their innocence and their carefree and bubbly personality that walked around without a care in the world because everything in their life felt stable to them. But they don't need to know that. All they need to know is that you love them conditionally and that you're going to be by their side no matter what. Which leads to the very last thing that I want to go over, and that is to show up. If your children are grieving, chances are so are you. But that doesn't mean that you get to just check out. It is not your children's job to take care of you. It is not your children's job to be your therapist. It is not your children's job to be the parent. So do your job. Drag yourself out of bed and be there for your child. Period. Even if you fail more than once, because you are going to fail more than once, keep trying. Keep working to be there for them, to show up for them in ways that are meaningful to them, and be the parent that they need you to be. Because your kids need you. They need you sober. They need you present. They need you stable. And if you need to get help to do that, then please get help to do that. But you do not get a second chance to raise your child. This is a one-shot deal. And you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. You can give yourself grace and forgive yourself and ask your child for forgiveness, but you need to keep trying and you need to keep working to show up for them in ways that are meaningful and the ways that they need you to be, because they have already suffered and you have already suffered. And not being there for them just compounds that suffering and compounds that loss that they're feeling. Allowing yourself to get caught up in your own emotions and your own struggles creates a secondary trauma by abandoning your responsibilities as their parent. There is no such thing as perfect grieving or perfect parents for that matter. And grieving is a really challenging process, and you're going to make mistakes and you're going to have failures along the way. But do your best, and then give yourself some grace and forgive yourself, and then do better. Kids are incredibly resilient and flexible, and they will forgive you. And if you really messed up, ask for their forgiveness, and then move forward together. Let them know that you're going to do better, and then work to do better. And forgive yourself. Because if you're compounding your own loss and your own grief by adding your own guilt on top of the grief and the loss, that's not going to be helping your child. So if you've been struggling and you haven't been able to show up in the ways that you need to, forgive yourself, ask for forgiveness from your child, and then get the help that you need to be able to walk this journey in a healthy way and support your kids in the way that they need. Because this is not an easy one, but it is one that you can do, and it is one that you can make it through if you seek help and if you put some of these foundations in place to be able to meet the needs of your children and meet your own needs and be able to work together as a family to make this journey through grief and loss. And that's all that I have for you today. Until next time, take care of yourself, be kind, and live your best life. If you enjoyed today's episode of the Highly Unlikely Podcast, you can find more by following me on Facebook at A Highly Unlikely Life, or find me on the web at ahighlyunlikelylife.com. And don't forget to subscribe.